There was a version of this story that could have gone considerably worse for the avoidant on the other end of it, and it's worth naming clearly, because the restraint that prevented that worse version from happening rarely gets the credit it actually deserves. Somewhere in the aftermath of genuine betrayal or genuine mistreatment, there's almost always a fork, a moment where the hurt person seriously considers doing something with their pain rather than simply carrying it, exposing what happened publicly, confronting the situation loudly and messily, making sure mutual friends and family understood exactly what kind of person they were actually dealing with. Most people who arrive at this fork don't take it. They choose the harder, quieter, considerably less satisfying path instead, and that choice deserves to be understood clearly for what it actually represents. Not weakness, and not simply an absence of sufficient anger, but genuine, deliberate restraint, chosen specifically because it aligned with a set of values considerably more durable than the temporary satisfaction any louder response might have provided. What follows is an exploration of exactly what this restraint actually costs the person choosing it, why the temptation to act differently is so often stronger and more understandable than it gets credit for, and why the avoidant on the receiving end of this restraint owes a genuine, if entirely unacknowledged, debt to the fact that it was chosen at all. Anyone listening who has felt the pull toward exposing, confronting, or publicly unraveling an avoidant ex-partner's carefully maintained reputation, and who chose instead to hold that impulse quietly and privately, deserves to understand exactly what that choice actually required, and why it matters considerably more than the silence surrounding it might suggest. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular topic deserves careful, dedicated attention, rather than being treated as an obvious, uncontroversial, given that restraint is always simply the correct response, requiring no further examination. The pull toward exposure and confrontation is genuinely strong, genuinely understandable, and dismissing it too quickly as something obviously wrong to feel risks invalidating a completely legitimate emotional response to genuine harm. This exploration takes that pull seriously, examining honestly why it develops so powerfully, before explaining why choosing not to act on it still tends to serve the person, feeling it considerably better than acting on it would. To understand why this particular temptation arises so powerfully in the aftermath of genuine betrayal, it helps to examine what actually happens psychologically when someone experiences significant, unfair harm at another person's hands. Betrayal, inconsistency, or mistreatment severe enough to genuinely warrant anger tends to activate a deep, evolutionarily old sense of injustice, a felt need for some kind of proportional response, evidence that the harm caused actually registered somewhere beyond the private, invisible experience of the person who absorbed it. This need for visible, external consequence is entirely human and entirely understandable, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than shame, regardless of whether it ultimately gets acted upon. This need often crystallizes into specific, concrete fantasies about what that visible consequence might actually look like. Imagined conversations where mutual friends finally learn the full truth. Imagined public moments where the avoidant's carefully curated reputation cracks under the weight of accurate, unflattering information. Imagined confrontations where every carefully rehearsed point finally gets delivered with the force it deserves. It helps to name a few specific forms these fantasies and these genuine temptations tend to take, because concrete examples make the overall pattern easier to recognize than an abstract description alone ever could. One common form involves the temptation to share an honest, detailed account of what happened with a wider circle than the situation genuinely calls for, reaching beyond the small number of trusted people who actually need or deserve that context, extending instead toward a broader audience whose primary function would be to damage the avoidant's standing, rather than to offer genuine support or genuine understanding. This particular temptation deserves distinguishing from something entirely legitimate, honestly discussing what happened with close friends or family who are naturally part of one's support system. The distinction lies in scale and in purpose, whether the sharing serves genuine processing and genuine support, or whether it's oriented primarily toward maximizing reputational damage. Another common form involves the temptation toward a single dramatic confrontation, arranged specifically to deliver a carefully prepared account of everything that went wrong, timed and staged for maximum emotional impact, sometimes even planned to occur in front of witnesses who might reinforce the confrontation's intended effect. This particular temptation tends to feel especially urgent in the weeks immediately following a significant betrayal, when the desire to be heard and acknowledged remains at its most acute, before time has had a chance to soften that specific urgency into something more manageable. A further common form involves the temptation to interfere, subtly or directly, with whatever the avoidant is currently building, a new relationship, a professional opportunity, a friendship, driven by a sense that they shouldn't be allowed to simply continue thriving without consequence, without the disruption that genuine accountability might have provided. This particular temptation deserves special attention because it extends beyond simply sharing accurate information and moves into something closer to active sabotage, a meaningfully different and considerably more ethically fraught category of response than the others already named. Recognizing each of these specific forms individually helps clarify exactly what restraint actually involves declining, rather than leaving that restraint as a vague, abstract concept difficult to apply to any specific, real decision. These fantasies aren't unusual or alarming. They reflect a genuine, deeply human response to feeling unfairly wronged, a mind searching for some way to restore balance to a situation that currently feels deeply unbalanced. It's worth naming why these fantasies feel so specifically appealing in the aftermath of harm caused by an avoidant partner in particular, distinct from betrayal by someone with a different relational style. As explored throughout other examinations of avoidant psychology, avoidants tend to place considerable, if quiet, value on maintaining a favorable, blameless self-image in the eyes of others, a pattern already discussed in detail elsewhere. This means exposing an avoidant's actual behavior, publicly and accurately, threatens something they particularly, specifically value protecting, which is precisely why this particular kind of retaliation feels so uniquely satisfying to imagine. It targets exactly the vulnerability an avoidant works hardest to defend. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone standing at the edge of a fire they didn't start, holding a bucket of water they could easily choose to throw onto it, watching flames that are causing real, visible damage to something that deserves protection. The temptation to throw that water isn't really about the fire itself. It's about the felt helplessness of simply watching damage occur without doing anything active to stop or address it. Choosing not to throw that water, even when throwing it would feel immediately satisfying and immediately active, requires trusting that some other, less visible, less immediately gratifying response actually serves the situation better than the dramatic, instant intervention currently available. This is close to what restraint actually requires in the aftermath of genuine betrayal. The impulse toward exposure or confrontation isn't irrational or excessive. It reflects a genuine, understandable desire to do something active in response to something that caused real harm. Choosing restraint instead doesn't mean that impulse was wrong to feel. It means recognizing, often through considerable internal effort, that acting on it wouldn't actually serve the deeper, more important goals already being pursued: dignity, genuine healing, and a clean, honest relationship with one's own values, regardless of how the other person ultimately behaved. It's worth naming specifically what this restraint tends to cost the person choosing it, because it deserves to be recognized as a genuine, ongoing effort rather than something that simply happens automatically once enough time has passed. This cost often includes tolerating a persistent, uncomfortable sense of injustice, an awareness that the avoidant continues moving through the world, perhaps even continues being perceived favorably by people who don't know the full story, without ever facing the kind of visible, immediate consequence that public exposure or confrontation might have provided. This awareness doesn't simply disappear once the decision toward restraint has been made. It often persists quietly, requiring ongoing, ordinary tolerance rather than a single, decisive resolution. This cost also often includes navigating specific difficult moments where the temptation toward exposure or confrontation resurfaces with particular intensity, encountering the avoidant unexpectedly, learning that they're being spoken of favorably by people who genuinely don't understand what actually happened, watching them begin a new relationship that seems, at least from the outside, considerably happier and more successful than anything offered during the previous one. Each of these moments can reignite the original impulse towards some kind of visible, corrective action, and choosing restraint in each of these specific recurring moments requires its own genuine, renewed effort, rather than simply representing a single decision made once and then permanently settled. There's something worth naming here regarding what actually happens to the genuine, legitimate anger underneath this entire temptation once the decision toward restraint has been made, because that anger doesn't simply disappear once its more dramatic external expressions get declined. It needs somewhere to go, and understanding what a healthy destination for that energy actually looks like matters considerably for making restraint sustainable, rather than simply another form of suppression that quietly accumulates pressure without any genuine outlet at all. Healthy channels for this energy tend to look considerably less dramatic than exposure or confrontation, but they serve the underlying need for acknowledgement, for processing, for a sense of active response rather than passive endurance, considerably more effectively over time. This might involve genuinely thorough, honest processing with a therapist or trusted confidant, someone capable of receiving the full, unfiltered account of what happened without requiring it to be softened for anyone else's comfort. It might involve channeling the same energy that once fueled fantasies of exposure into concrete, personal growth instead, building a life, a career, a sense of self-worth robust enough that the avoidant's eventual reputation or eventual consequences simply stop feeling like the measure of whether justice was actually served. It might also involve simply allowing the anger to exist and be felt fully, without needing to resolve it into any particular action at all, trusting that anger, like any other genuine emotion, eventually moves through its own natural course when it's actually permitted to be felt honestly, rather than either suppressed entirely or acted upon impulsively in service of quick, temporary relief. This last option deserves particular emphasis because it's often the most overlooked. An entire third path between suppression and exposure that simply allows difficult feeling to be present and acknowledged without requiring any external, dramatic resolution in order to eventually settle. Finding and using these healthier channels doesn't mean the original temptation toward exposure or confrontation was somehow illegitimate to have felt. It simply means redirecting the genuine, considerable energy behind that temptation toward destinations that actually serve long-term healing, rather than destinations that offer only brief, temporary satisfaction followed by the kind of ongoing entanglement already discussed as one of exposure's less obvious but genuinely significant costs. There's something important worth naming here regarding why choosing restraint, despite its genuine ongoing cost, ultimately tends to serve the person choosing it better than the alternative would have, distinct from any question of what it means for the avoidant on the receiving end of that restraint. Public exposure and dramatic confrontation, however immediately satisfying they might feel in the moment they're delivered, tend to produce outcomes considerably more complicated and considerably less genuinely resolving than they initially promise. They frequently draw the person delivering them into an ongoing, exhausting battle for public opinion, one that requires continued energy and continued emotional investment in managing how the situation gets perceived by others, precisely the kind of ongoing entanglement that restraint, by contrast, actually allows someone to step away from entirely. This distinction matters considerably because it reframes restraint not simply as the more morally admirable choice, though it often is that as well, but as the choice more likely to actually produce the genuine peace and genuine forward movement someone is presumably hoping to reach. Confrontation and exposure tend to extend a person's entanglement with the very situation they're trying to move past, requiring ongoing management of reactions, ongoing defense of one's own account against whatever counter-narrative the avoidant might offer in response, ongoing emotional investment in a battle that, even when technically won in terms of public perception, rarely produces the kind of clean, genuine resolution that simply walking away and building something new actually tends to provide. It's worth addressing directly something that deserves careful, honest treatment, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misread as suggesting that choosing restraint means the harm experienced wasn't real, wasn't significant, or doesn't deserve honest acknowledgement. This is not what's being suggested here. Choosing not to pursue public exposure or dramatic confrontation is entirely compatible with continuing to name what happened honestly and accurately in appropriate private contexts, with trusted friends, with a therapist, within one's own private reflection and processing. Restraint refers specifically to declining the more public, more dramatic forms of response, not to suppressing or minimizing the honest truth of what actually occurred. This distinction matters because it protects against a potential misreading that would turn healthy restraint into unhealthy suppression, pretending nothing significant happened, softening the story for everyone's comfort, extending exactly the kind of protective, blameless narrative already cautioned against in other examinations of this topic. It's worth naming a few markers that help distinguish genuine, healthy restraint from unhealthy suppression, since these two states can sometimes look similar from the outside, despite reflecting genuinely different internal experiences. Genuine restraint tends to coexist with honest, ongoing acknowledgement of what happened, expressed appropriately in private, supportive contexts, alongside a clear, settled sense of one's own boundaries regarding the avoidant going forward. Unhealthy suppression, by contrast, tends to involve minimizing or denying what happened even in these private, appropriate contexts, sometimes extending the same protective, blameless narrative toward oneself that was already declined toward public consumption, a pattern that tends to interfere with genuine healing considerably more than honest, private acknowledgement ever would. Another useful marker involves how much ongoing energy gets devoted to monitoring the avoidant's continued life and continued reputation. Genuine restraint tends to be accompanied by a gradual, genuine decrease in this kind of monitoring over time, as attention naturally redirects toward one's own life and one's own healing. Suppression, by contrast, sometimes coexists with continued active monitoring, watching for evidence of consequence or regret from a distance, which suggests that the underlying need for external validation and external consequence hasn't actually been resolved, simply redirected into a quieter, less visible form of the same unresolved need. Recognizing these markers matters because it offers a way of checking in honestly with oneself, ensuring that restraint remains the healthy, deliberate choice this exploration has been describing throughout, rather than gradually curdling into something closer to suppression, which tends to serve genuine healing considerably less effectively over time. Restraint and honesty aren't actually opposed to each other. It's entirely possible and genuinely healthy to hold both simultaneously, an honest, accurate private account of what happened, paired with a deliberate choice not to weaponize that account publicly or dramatically against the person who caused it. There's something worth exploring further because it addresses a specific, important question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far, whether this kind of restraint actually produces any benefit for the avoidant who received it, or whether it simply represents a one-sided sacrifice that serves the person choosing it without offering anything meaningful in return to the person who arguably didn't deserve any additional consideration at all. This question deserves an honest, carefully qualified answer, rather than a simple, satisfying resolution in either direction. Restraint does, in a genuine sense, offer the avoidant something they likely don't fully realize they've received: the preservation of their reputation and their relationships with mutual friends and family, a preservation they didn't actually earn through their own behavior, but that was nonetheless extended to them, whether consciously as an act of restraint or simply as a byproduct of someone else's genuine desire to move forward without ongoing conflict. This preservation carries real, practical value for the avoidant, allowing them to continue moving through their existing social world without the kind of significant, visible consequence that public exposure might have produced. It's worth being direct about something important here, because this observation could easily be misread as suggesting that the avoidant deserves gratitude, or that this preservation should somehow be acknowledged or repaid. Nothing in this exploration suggests that restraint creates any obligation on the avoidant's part, and nothing suggests that gratitude, acknowledgement, or any kind of reciprocal consideration is actually owed in return. The person choosing restraint did so for their own reasons, serving their own values and their own genuine well-being, not as a gift extended toward the avoidant requiring any kind of return. Whatever benefit the avoidant happens to receive as an incidental byproduct of that restraint remains exactly that, incidental, rather than something earned, deserved, or requiring acknowledgement. There's something crucial worth naming here as well, something that deserves direct, honest treatment rather than being glossed over in favor of a tidier conclusion. Choosing restraint doesn't mean the anger and the impulse toward more dramatic action were somehow wrong or shameful to have felt in the first place. These feelings reflect an entirely legitimate response to genuine harm, and their presence, even when never acted upon, deserves acknowledgement and validation rather than suppression or self-judgment. The goal was never to stop feeling this impulse entirely. It was simply to choose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to act on it in ways that would ultimately serve the moment's satisfaction more than one's own longer-term well-being and one's own genuine values. There's something worth turning toward now that centers entirely on the person who chose this restraint, rather than on the avoidant who incidentally benefited from it, because everything explored throughout this piece has necessarily touched on what this restraint means for the avoidant's reputation and social standing, and that focus, however relevant, shouldn't overshadow what this choice actually reveals and costs for the person who made it. Choosing restraint repeatedly and deliberately in the face of genuine temptation toward exposure or confrontation represents considerable, ongoing emotional discipline, a genuine act of self-respect that has nothing to do with protecting the avoidant and everything to do with protecting one's own integrity, one's own peace, and one's own relationship with one's own values. This discipline deserves recognition as the genuine accomplishment it represents, entirely independent of whether the avoidant who benefited from it incidentally ever recognizes, appreciates, or deserves that benefit in any way. For anyone listening who has felt this exact pull, the temptation to expose, to confront, to make absolutely certain that an avoidant ex-partner's carefully maintained reputation reflected the full, accurate truth of what actually happened and who chose, instead, to hold that impulse privately and move forward without acting on it. there's something important worth claiming here. That choice wasn't weakness, and it wasn't an absence of sufficient anger or sufficient justification. It was a genuine, considerable act of self-respect, choosing one's own long-term peace and one's own integrity over the shorter, more immediately satisfying alternative that remained genuinely available the entire time. There's something crucial worth naming here as well. Something that deserves direct, honest treatment rather than being glossed over in favor of a tidier conclusion. Choosing restraint doesn't mean the anger and the impulse toward more dramatic action were somehow wrong or shameful to have felt in the first place. These feelings reflect an entirely legitimate response to genuine harm, and their presence, even when never acted upon, deserves acknowledgement and validation rather than suppression or self-judgment. It's worth naming too why holding both of these truths simultaneously, legitimate anger and deliberate restraint, matters more than resolving them into a single, simpler story. A story that only acknowledges the restraint, without honouring the genuine, legitimate anger underneath it, risks producing exactly the kind of quiet suppression already cautioned against elsewhere in this exploration. A performance of having transcended the anger entirely, rather than an honest, ongoing relationship with feeling it, while still choosing not to act on it destructively. A story that only acknowledges the anger, without honouring the genuine strength required to hold it without acting on it, in the more dramatic, ultimately less serving ways already described, risks minimising exactly the kind of integrity this entire exploration has been trying to recognise and validate. Both truths, held together, rather than collapsed into one simpler alternative, offer the most accurate, most honest account of what this entire experience actually involved. There's a final point worth making, because it reframes the actual significance of everything explored throughout this entire piece, in a way that matters considerably more than any specific question about whether an avoidant ex-partner ever recognises or appreciates the restraint that quietly protected them. This choice was never actually about the avoidant at all, despite how much of this exploration has necessarily focused on what that restraint meant for them specifically. It was about who the person choosing restraint wanted to remain, regardless of how unfairly they'd been treated, regardless of how satisfying the alternative might have felt in the moment, and regardless of whether anyone, including the avoidant who benefited from it, ever fully understood what that choice actually required. For anyone listening who recognises themselves in this description, who held their own version of that bucket of water, watching real damage occur, feeling the genuine, understandable pull to throw it, and chose, instead, to set it down and walk away. There's a specific kind of quiet pride worth claiming here. Not because the avoidant deserved that restraint, and not because they'll ever fully understand or appreciate what it actually cost. Simply because choosing who to remain, even when the alternative would have been so much easier to justify, represents exactly the kind of integrity that doesn't require anyone else's recognition in order to be real, valuable, and permanently, quietly, one's own. It's worth naming, finally, why the capacity for this kind of restraint tends to serve someone well far beyond this one specific situation, extending into essentially every future circumstance where genuine harm and genuine temptation toward dramatic, satisfying retaliation might arise again. Developing the ability to feel real anger fully, without needing to immediately convert that anger into external, dramatic action, represents a durable, transferable form of emotional maturity, considerably more valuable across an entire lifetime than any single instance of restraint applied to any single relationship. This capacity, once genuinely developed, tends to serve someone in professional conflicts, in family disputes, in essentially any future situation where the temptation toward immediate, satisfying retaliation might otherwise threaten longer-term well-being and longer-term integrity. There's one final thought worth leaving on, because it addresses something worth naming honestly rather than leaving implied. Choosing restraint doesn't mean the story ends in silence forever. And it doesn't mean the truth of what happened has to remain permanently hidden or permanently softened. There will likely continue to be appropriate contexts, close friendships, future relationships, where honest history matters, moments of genuine reflection, where the full, accurate truth deserves to be spoken plainly. Restraint refers specifically to declining the dramatic, public, reputation-targeting version of that truth-telling, not to permanent, universal silence about what actually happened. The truth remains available to be told, honestly and appropriately, whenever and wherever it genuinely serves understanding, rather than simply serving damage. This distinction matters because it offers a final, important piece of permission. Choosing not to take matters into one's own hands, in the sense this exploration has been describing throughout, doesn't mean choosing to disappear from one's own story, or erase what actually happened from one's own history. It simply means choosing dignity over spectacle, choosing one's own long-term peace over the shorter, louder alternative, and choosing, above all, to remain someone whose integrity doesn't depend on how badly someone else's behaviour might have tempted them to abandon it.